Hello watch enthusiasts. Now as you know, I appreciate dive watches a great deal, from that aspirational element of adoring the interest that mankind has showed towards the ocean, the depths and just the exploration and technology which goes into producing a suitable and high quality dive watch. And so I was extremely intrigued when Ocean Crawler contacted me with the interest of showing their new watch, the Ocean Navigator. And the reason why I chose to take a look at the watch before producing the review is because the specifications caught my eye immediately. This is a titanium 600-metre dive watch with a helium escape valve and internal rotating compass, as well as an external rotating bezel, various sapphire elements, and a very interesting movement which acts as an interesting competitor to the ETA 2824. And so I thought it would be worthwhile showing this watch on the channel, and after handling the watch, I was really very much sure that I was going to show the watch on the channel and not simply suggest not producing the review as a result of being displeased with the quality, which is sometimes the case. But I'm pleased to say I was extremely impressed with this watch, and so I'm glad to be able to show it here today. Now, in terms of the review itself, I would of course like to state that I'm not being paid to produce this review at all, nor am I being paid for a favourable review at all in any way, in the sense that I really do feel these reviews would lose their integrity and their truth in terms of being able to give you, my viewers, an honest description and explanation of pieces I would genuinely recommend. And so this is the outer box the watch comes in this rather well produced and tastefully designed box in cardboard, as you can see, and it is rather a large box with Ocean Crawler on the front. And so I will take the watch out of the box, and indeed take the inner box out of this cardboard external piece to show you the wrapping and the presentation of the watch, which I think often says quite a lot about the attention to detail of the brand. And so here is the watch in its box. And what I will point out before I talk about the accessories that come with the watch and the box itself is that this watch costs $1,299, which equates to about £1,000. And so it's very much in that market of Oris Aquises, for example, or high-end Hamiltons. And so we're really working with a high mid-tier or low luxury market in terms of the intended market for this timepiece, in terms of what's being offered when it comes to the box, the quality of the product itself, and the general details in the market it's appealing to, which I feel is important to point out at this stage in the review, because it does give a certain context to the reason why the watch has been designed in the way it has, and thus builds the appeal of the product in its own right. And so with the watch, of course, you get the manual, which gives a basic explanation of how the watch works, and just the general sort of information you'd want. Whilst as well as this, you get a very attractive leather stamped style of wallet, which inside features the warranty card, which is very, very well made. As you can see, it's brushed metal with this Ocean Crawler cutout, and of course states it has a 5-year warranty, which is great to see, especially from a smaller brand. And of course this can be used as an actual wallet on the basis that it has the money clip and space for a variety of cards, which is a really nice area where attention to detail has clearly been taken to produce an appealing product. Now the box itself, as you can see, features a leatherette style of casing with a form of veneer on its surface, as well as the fact it's very well hinged on the back and is extremely solidly constructed. Then internally, if one pops it open, like so, because it's magnetised, one can see the timepiece itself, as well as its spare strap, which as you can see is a very attractive nylon strap with leather backing and leather around the holes, and of course a very well signed buckle. But I'll take the watch now out of its box and show you the watch in more detail to give you an idea of what this watch is trying to be, and indeed how well it succeeds. And so here is the watch in all its glory. And as you can see, the watch appeals to a very crisp, very modern style of titanium, sort of very high water resistance dive watch. And whilst the size of the watch is somewhat deceiving as a result of the light weight of the watch, I should give you the dimensions first of all. The watch is 43.1mm from side to side, 50mm from lug to lug, and 14.8mm thick, making it a very sizable dive watch, and certainly one of a more masculine size. However, I feel the watch carries itself extremely well, courtesy of the fact it's so extremely lightweight. Because the case of the watch is all titanium, as you can see, although I don't think the case back is titanium, nor is the bezel, as a result of the fact that titanium has a nasty habit of sticking to itself. And so as a result, the watch is incredibly light. It really is remarkable just how light this watch is by comparison to other watches. But of course titanium makes extremely good sense, because of course a titanium watch in the dive watch segment will be exposed to salt water and indeed the corrosion that causes on a very regular basis. And so therefore having a material like titanium which naturally develops a surface which is reaction resistant, so it doesn't react to the salt water, means that you will immediately have a greater resilience, which is why watches like the Tudor Pelagos, for example, work so well in titanium. And so the design of the watch takes inspiration from a great deal of roots, and indeed one has a really wonderful aesthetic which doesn't look at all derivative, but rather looks rather different and is really unique, which is great to see, especially from a smaller brand trying to produce something new, where often watches tend to look like each other. This is a very different looking timepiece. Now, as you can see, the watch itself has a case shape which is immediately somewhat remarkable in the sense that it doesn't have the conventional style of single crown. Instead, we have 3 crowns, and I'll explain the purposes of them at one at a time. But the case itself also features a large, well-mounted bezel which fits far above the case, as you can see, and does have a certain lip over the side. The lugs are twisted, as you can see, like for example an Omega Seamaster, but doesn't have any sort of form which appears to be derivative of that style, because they're very different in their execution. Of course, starting with the bezel itself, since that's the most immediately noticeable aspect of the watch, the bezel has a sapphire insert, so in fact the numerals are beneath that clear sapphire coat, as you can see, and match that domed sapphire crystal on the front of the watch beautifully. The bezel itself is domed, as you can see, which gives a great sort of 50 fathoms style to it, which is both old-fashioned but without the use of vintage luminova, and on a very modern watch actually plays off a far more aquatic style, which is further from the sort of vintage diver style and much closer to a modern instrument. It is also fully luminescent, if you look at the numerals all the way around, which I will show you in the loom shot later on in the video. The bezel is 120 click, as you can see, and does have very firm action, and there really is no play in this. It's extremely well built, and there's no back play whatsoever. And the grip is very good, although at first, when I tried the watch on, the bezel was rather stiff, although it's loosened up within time and has settled, and actually a very usable style of use, which I presume is just because the seals holding the bezel in place were new. And so it moves along in this 120 click motion and lines up extremely well with the 12 o'clock marker to give you a very clear display of the time. Of course, one doesn't have the pip at 12 o'clock just as a result of that sapphire bezel having that fully luminous treatment. And so in terms of the way it sits proud of the case, it does have a very significant footprint over the top of the watch, but doesn't interfere with the crowns and doesn't pose any problem for the owner. Now, the dial, which is of course below that beautiful anti-reflective coated sapphire crystal, which is domed and meets the bezel extremely tightly, there's no discernible gap between the bezel and the crystal. And beneath that we see a dial which is slightly glossy in its blackness, which is only added to by the surface of that anti-reflective coating, which isn't being shown very well here as a result of a studio light, but generally I've had no problems with legibility, although of course due to the curvature of the crystal there is distortion at the extreme angles. Now the dial itself features very, very clear and very legible luminous markers. As you can see, they're block-like and appear sort of almost rectangular in their forms and are painted directly onto the dial rather than being applied, which some people will argue isn't as attractive a process, and I think I would agree, though in this case, because the hands don't have any polished metal on them either, I think they would look out of place. The dial is very clear immediately, although there is a great deal of text with Ocean Crawler, in addition to Shipwreck Hunter Automatic 2000 feet Ocean Navigator. And in my eyes this is slightly too much text, though these watches are assembled in New York, but do use a Swiss movement. And the dial itself is very legible thanks to those large indices, which are very clear against the black background. And even the second hand is very clear thanks to its orange and white style, which is matched on the hands, because as you can see, the minute hand is orange and the hour hand is white, which adds to the contrast against the dial and makes it look extremely clear. Now, I did have a few concerns with these hands before handling the watch that they would look too similar and thus wouldn't be terribly legible, but I'm pleased to say that I haven't had any problems with that, even in the dark in fact. Despite the fact the hands are very similar in length, they're very easily told apart just from their different shape, and because those triangles are very easy for the eye to discern. And the dial is itself very simple if you ignore that ring running around it, which I will talk about in a moment. But overall it's a simple dial, but that does have a great deal of text on it, and that is one area where I would change it, because I don't think that having Shipwreck Hunter, for example, on the dial particularly adds to anything, nor frankly does Automatic. I would appreciate simply having Ocean Crawler 2000 feet Ocean Navigator, for example. But that's very much down to the manufacturer and down to personal taste, because objectively I really can't fault the dial. However, what's difficult to show on this video, but which really is highly apparent, is just how reflective that dial is and just how beautifully effective that is. Because it creates a phenomenal sort of depth to the dial, which I think complements the case. Because of course the case of the watch is this matted titanium, which as you can see, due to the nature of titanium, is this dark, almost brown grey, which actually appears extremely mechanical and very technical, and in many ways far less luxurious than steel, however still representing a style which is just extremely attractive, and is so different to a steel case. As you can see, due to the fact this is grade 2 titanium, one doesn't have any polished finishes, but rather the whole thing is matted, which incidentally I think suits the watch extremely well, because it means it can take on a more technical sort of charm, which is mirrored by the crowns. And as you can see, the lugs are twisted and extremely substantial, and curve down towards the wrist very significantly, which means that once the watch is mounted on the wrist, and I will do a proper wrist shot later on in the video, it curves around very well. If one turns over the watch, then the case back shows the Ocean Crawler logo, which is very nicely engraved and rather embossed, because one sees it's a negative engraving, so one actually has it sort of protruding from the back of the watch. Water resistant, 60 atmospheres, and these watches are all tested to the full 600 metres, with sapphire crystal titanium automatic, and there are 100 of these being made. What's amusing to me, though, is the fact they've included a fossilised sort of trilobite on the back of it, because of course the movement of this watch is produced by fossil. And that brings me on to the movement of this watch, which is the fossil, or rather the STP1-1, which is a movement which has caused a degree of debate, because it's another ETA clone as opposed to the Solita option. And this, in terms of its specifications, offers, on paper, much better specifications than the equivalent standard grade ETA, if one looks at the prices by comparison. And I'm certainly not comparing this watch to, for example, a top grade or a chronometer grade version ETA, because those do have certain elements which are distinctly different and perhaps one could view as higher quality. But certainly when it comes to, for example, the version of Niverox the spring is made out of, this movement does technically have a higher grade of part. There is also an extra jewel, which again is I imagine primarily in order to simply differentiate it from the standard ETA. But these are fully decorated movements, and whilst it's commonly accepted that a great deal of the parts of these movements are made in the Far East, they are assembled in Switzerland, and as per Swiss rules, 60% of their value is Swiss, and I don't know what that means really in terms of the manufacturing. But personally, I would disregard that, because the watch is so fantastically made, and the movement itself keeps such good time that frankly I have no complaints. So through the couple of weeks I've been wearing this watch about, it's been keeping extremely good time, and for me it's been running at about plus 3 seconds a day, which is very good, and bearing in mind the fact the watch isn't chronometer certified, though as far as I'm aware STP movements like this are regulated in 5 positions, which is great to see. One does have a fair accuracy for a watch which hasn't formally been chronometer certified, for example, but keeps frankly within those chronometer guidelines. Now, in addition to that, the power reserve of this movement is meant to be 44 hours, and that's already 6 hours more than the 38 hours of an ETA 2824, but in truth with this watch, the most I got was 51 hours. And of course that I imagine will vary, because 44 hours is the standard. 51 hours for a movement of this type is frankly remarkable, and I must say having the slightly longer power reserve makes for a very convenient wearing operation, because it means you can leave it the full 2 days. And the movement does of course run as a clone to an ETA 2824, so it is interchangeable with an ETA 2824, though not all parts are interchangeable between the two movements. So if you did choose down the line, this watch would potentially take an ETA 2824. But certainly in terms of the quality, I wouldn't be put off by the fact it's not an ETA or a Solita from these brands that we recognise so well, but rather I think the Fossil Group have done an extremely good job with this movement in order to make a movement which is very stable from what I've seen, keeps extremely good time and has a long power reserve, which really is what you want from a movement of this type. And now, in terms of the case itself, because the watch itself is a curious piece in the respect that it has these 3 crowns. And I will point out that none of the crowns are the same. And at first this threw me, because as you can see if I hold the watch out here, the crowns are all different. But after wearing it for a bit, it immediately became apparent why these crowns are different. So the standard winding crown is of course in the conventional position and isn't guarded, but frankly due to the size of the crown it actually makes it far more pleasant to operate, because it's quite heavily sunken into the case and doesn't cause any trouble in terms of catching on things. And one could argue the crown looks a bit more like a pilot's watch crown, with a heavy protrusion, as you can see, this style of onion form. But it's extremely easy to manipulate as a result of that shape of it. And the winding on this STP movement is extremely smooth. As you can see, there's none of the sort of clicking that one often gets with a lot of movements, but rather it's a smooth run. In addition to that, it is of course hand winding and hacking. As you can see there, it hacks, and of course has a quick set date. But in terms of the way the crown operates, it operates very smoothly. The crown itself screws in very, very cleanly into the case without any real trouble whatsoever. And of course it is signed with that Ocean Crawler logo. Then on the opposite side of the case, one has two crowns. And the first I'll address is the bottom one, which is more heavily sunken into the case because one's not going to be using it as much, is the helium escape valve. So it unscrews quite simply, and unlike, for example, an Omega helium escape valve, it actually leaves the threading. So once it's left the threading, it turns freely rather than remaining on the threading, which is of no real consequence, but I thought was worthwhile pointing out. And then, of course, screws back in very smoothly. Here, however, we have a very interesting piece, because here we have the compass. Because as long as you can see the sun, you can use this watch to navigate, hence the name Ocean Navigator. Because this unscrews, as you can see, like so, and from there, one can manipulate this internal bezel. Now, it rotates freely, as you can see, but the way it operates is that if one assumed the sun was straight ahead of me, one would line up the hour hand with the sun, and then indeed, bearing in mind that it's about 4:30 now, one would line up the internal bezel according to the time, because it has the 24-hour graduations on it. So if one then lines that up, overshot, like so, the compass is now arranged so that one can look at it and see the four directions and indeed any of the degrees in between, which is a very clever idea. And I actually asked about this because I wasn't sure, because east has an H next to it. That's because that's where the horizon will be, and so that creates quite an interesting feature on a watch which conventionally wouldn't have this sort of complication. And it's very easy to use. The crown works very well, and thanks to the fact it's slightly further out, one can very easily access it, whether it's on the wrist. Although, frankly, one wouldn't be using this on the wrist, because one has to reorientate the watch in relation to the sun. But certainly it's an interesting feature, and is more than a gimmick in my experience, because it's quite a useful thing to have if you're going to be using a watch like this in the field. And so really one has a very appealing dive watch in terms of being a very versatile piece, with the professionalism of a 600-metre dive watch, with all the bells and whistles you would expect from an accurate movement of very high quality, which is, in terms of the specifications, Swiss-made. And I will point out this isn't any more or less Swiss-made than other equivalents in terms of the legislation, in terms of what it allows, which means you have a very respectable ETA clone in it with very good accuracy. And of course, in terms of the places these watches are made, they're very clear. They're assembled in New York. In terms of the origins of the rest of the watch, of course, that movement does have some Asian components, though of course that's the case with the vast majority of Swiss-made mechanical movements. But what you get here is a very complete package in terms of offering something which is more robust in terms of its build, with that titanium case, the use of that helium escape valve, in addition to these screwed lugs, which, as you can see, are double-sided screws, so they're more sturdy than a spring bar would be. Although in some ways are more inconvenient to change straps on, they do offer the ultimate sort of security. And so you get this balance between something like an Oris Aquis, for example, in terms of being a more stylish dive watch, and something like a Zin U1, which would be a much more technical dive watch to this, and far more technologically robust. And so in the case of this watch, you get something which is really a brilliant compromise between style and sheer resilience to the elements, which is very interesting from a new manufacturer. Because in terms of something else on the market, I haven't seen anything else which has this set of features, and this very interesting balance. In the dark, you can see this watch truly is phenomenally legible. So as you can see, the watch has the fully luminescent bezel, as you can see around the edge of the dial, in addition to luminous indices and very heavily luminous hands. Interestingly, the date window is also loomed, which is a curious touch and something which I appreciate. Whether it adds legibility or not, I don't know, but it creates a fantastically cool effect in the dark, because one can see that outline. But certainly there's no lack of legibility here, and my initial fears with the hands appearing too similar are certainly not correct, because as you can see, one can very quickly pick them apart, as a result of the fact the hour hand is significantly shorter, and the minute hand extends exactly to the edge of those indices, making it all the more legible. One curious touch which I wasn't expecting is just how legible the second hand is, which creates that little triangle of lume, which is very, very legible and doesn't fade like other watches very quickly, and which means you'll always have that that legible demonstration of the fact the watch is still operating, which I think is often neglected, I think, by a lot of brands who don't include luminescence on their second hands. And so I'll turn the light back on and show you the wrist shot, because I'm very curious to show you how this watch runs on the wrist, in terms of being a watch which is significantly larger than watches I tend to wear, but still gives a brilliant look and is very light. Here is the watch on the wrist, and as you can see, the watch itself with its 43.1mm case fits extremely well. And of course I did say it has a 50mm lug-to-lug length, which is certainly long, but thanks to the fact there is such a curvature to the lugs, it sits very comfortably on the wrist. And thanks to the fact that the lug bars are lowered down the case thanks to those curved lugs, it means the watch actually sits on the wrist like a watch which is much flatter, but with a higher extension over the top. And this may not make a great deal of sense, but it means that the strap encircles the wrist, and rather than being pulled upward, it remains down and well seated. And this means that when one turns the bezel, the watch doesn't move about or jiggle about. It means you have a very firm grip on the watch, and it doesn't cause any trouble in that regard. And also just sits very comfortably whether one wants to do the strap very tightly or a bit more loosely. Of course, one also has very easy access to these crowns. Whilst admittedly the helium escape valve is more difficult to get to, one would simply remove the watch to do that if one was going to do it professionally, bearing in mind that one certainly would have time in the diving bell. But in this regard, one has a watch which is a very complete package, because whilst this watch doesn't declare that it's trying to be Swiss made, and indeed doesn't say so on the dial, which I appreciate, this watch is made and assembled in New York. The watch itself is an appealing timepiece from the perspective that it uses cherry-picked elements. For example, that bezel, which is a gorgeous sapphire insert, does draw from other dive watches, but not in a sort of an homage sort of way, but simply it takes a very good idea of having that fully luminous bezel and uses it to good purpose. Likewise, the movement was a very good choice, because I think choosing the STP movement over spending a great deal more on an ETA movement or a Solita movement, in this particular instance was a very good move, because it means that they're able to get a movement for this watch which admittedly is a bit more new in terms of its existence on the market, but nonetheless is a movement which gives certainly very, very impressive results and seems to work extremely well. And so one has a watch which for £1,000 offers a great deal. And whilst I wouldn't compare it in terms of finishing, for example, to the likes of the larger brands like something like Omega, for example, it's very well made for its price range and competes very, very well with its competitors. And of course it offers something very different to, for example, a Zin 104 for this price range. But that's a very different watch which appeals to a very different sort of customer. And whilst this watch is a piece which is of very high quality if you look at the finishing across the watch, it creates a very nice balance between a far more dressy dive watch, thanks to that bezel and the design of the watch, with something far more technical, like for example a Zin T1 being their titanium dive watch. And of course one can't compare them directly because that's a much more expensive timepiece, which of course is going to be of higher quality thanks to the attention to detail and the sheer expense spent on it. But for the price of this watch, and from a small brand like Ocean Crawler, they've done a very, very good job of creating a very interesting option for someone who wants a dive watch which is unique in terms of something on the market, but also something which offers impressive technical value and something of real quality for an affordable price tag. And so I'd be very curious to hear what you think of this watch in the comments down below, because it's impressed me a great deal in terms of offering something very different to its competitors on the market, and as such produces something which I think will appeal to a very different type of customer, someone who wants something a bit different, and something with a more varied application. And so if you did enjoy the video, then do like, share and subscribe to help the channel and to be able to enjoy more content here in future. So thank you very much for watching. This is Armand the Watch Guy, out.